Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor McLeod, and in this in-person interview, I speak with Senior Teaching Fellow at Edinburgh University and Honorary Research Assistant at Drug Science, Dr. Anna Ross. In this interview, we discuss Dr. Ross's background and what led her into the cannabis sector, drug policy barriers in Scotland, the benefits of developing a greater perspective towards drug policy, the importance of lived experience regarding drug consumption, the Scottish Cannabis Consortium, the Scottish Psychedelic Research Society, and what to look forward to in 2023 regarding drug policy, cannabis and psychedelics. Make sure and like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon, where you could help to build a stronger cannabis media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Thanks for joining me, Anna. This is brilliant.
It's all right.
So essentially, for people that are unaware of what you do, could you describe how you got into cannabis and what it is you're actually doing?
Yeah. How I got into cannabis.
8-hour podcast.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'd been using cannabis since I was 18, initially sort of both recreationally and also for insomnia. I used to get really, really intense dreams, and they used to affect me right up until the middle of the day. And I found when I smoked cannabis, obviously that cuts the dreams out. And then, have used sort of ever since, really. But I've got into this more policy field of cannabis via my drugs policy reform work, because I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and I did it in drug policy participation, in which I set up a deliberative group called the Scottish Drug Policy Conversations, and I did interviews and all sorts of other stuff, and effectively got involved in kind of advocacy work around drug policy reform. And during one of the conversations, so the Scottish Drugs Policy Conversations was more about the wider drugs policy reform, what we're going to do about the war on drugs, and also trying to bring people together who would not traditionally be talking about drug use, because the other thing that I was really passionate about was coming from a clubbing and raving background, and just from a general kind of like normal alternative scene background. Drug use is ubiquitous and it's ubiquitous in a very positive way often. It's a social enhancer. I mean, honestly, like the amount of people, that if you just make a wee joke about drugs, everyone knows what you're talking about. So what we were trying to do within the Scottish Drugs Policy Conversations was really bring that to the fore, because all of the narratives are around drug harm, and we wanted to highlight that only is actually a result of structural issues such as capitalism and patriarchy and the criminal justice system. So that was, and then one of the conversations was actually a conversation on cannabis, and during that time, so I'd met up with a woman called Bernie McCready. She started up this thing called the Medicinal Cannabis Scotland Reform Group, MCRS. And I met up with her because she'd managed to get some MSPs in a room together to talk about it. And I was like, wow, okay, like what's she doing? So we teamed up, and I had an event with the Scottish Drugs Policy Conversations on cannabis, and we came up with like models of ideas, and that really spearheaded me and Bernie working together and just really trying to get the MSPs involved in a conversation around medicinal cannabis predominantly. Although we were also looking at wider, how would you regulate it? And so we managed to have a couple of informal parliamentary events. So Pauline McNeill sponsored them, but they weren't like official cross-party events. And we got quite a lot of interest. I mean, interestingly enough, the shadow health secretary for the Tories came along, and he actually wrote to Theresa May to said, I've met with stakeholders and I believe that there is a case for medicinal cannabis. So anyway, that's how I got into the more policy side of it. Bernie and I parted ways, and we set up, Pauline and I set up, and Rona McLeod, set up the official Scottish cross-party on medicinal cannabis. And Lisa, I'm forgetting about Lisa as well. So Lisa Quarrell has been a colleague. So she was working with me and Bernie together, and then it's just been me and her really. So and we're into our second parliamentary session now on the cross-party, and so that's that side of things. And then about a year ago, me and my colleague Fiona and Lisa were going, right, nothing's really happening. Okay, we've got the ministers involved, we're communicating with the health department, and we're communicating with different people, but nothing's actually happening. You know, like it became legalized in 2018, but as you know, like hardly any prescriptions were given out. Lisa's a family member. She's got a son who's epileptic. She's spending horrendous amounts of money on getting his medication. The consultants aren't budging. They're refusing to prescribe. So we're sort of in a situation now where we're like, okay, so we've got the ministers on board. We've got some engagement from the health department, but we really need a team in Scotland now. We need a team of people to actually get together. So we set up the Scottish Cannabis Consortium.
Yeah.
And that is trying to get everyone who's involved in the different parts of cannabis together to come and do little bits of project work. So, for example, one of the most important ones that we really want to do at the moment is to get SIGN, which is the Scottish Medical Guidance guys, to agree or issue guidance on one specific cannabis-based medicine, which is Bedrolite, and to issue guidance to recommend it as a potential treatment for treatment-resistant epilepsy. But unfortunately, the cannabis community in Scotland is quite scattered. So what we're trying to do is bring people together. So we can, because in order to do that, you need to have a group of experts that can, you know, and they need to be Scottish based because basically the medical community in Scotland,
If you were to describe the Scottish landscape, because I'm aware that obviously drug policy is kind of imprisoned in Westminster. You're in a position where obviously our drug policy is 100% dictated down in London.
Yeah.
So I mean, how would you describe what can be practically, apart from the groups you're describing, and creating a unity behind all factors of cannabis in Scotland? Like, how would you describe the landscape in Scotland? Like, what is it? Is it completely fractured, or is there movement?
How would I describe well, I can describe the landscape in Scotland as I know it to my sort of viewpoint, because I'm aware that there's actually a lot going on that, you know, that are not engaged within my specific sphere. Although the whole point is I'm really trying to get more people onto the cross party, because if we have members on the cross party, we can then form these working groups that can then work together to come up with guidance and guidelines that they can present to the government before the big boy pharmaceutical companies come on board. I have no problem working with pharmaceuticals. So basically, okay, the landscape in Scotland at the moment is that we have to start with the general use. Cannabis use is like ubiquitous amongst Scottish communities. You know, like, you know, not everyone uses it, but everyone knows somebody that smokes. It's nothing, you know, it's, you can buy cannabis, you know, that is packaged and branded and, you know, like it exists there. And I mean, I've even heard of, there's like a co-op, like fair trade co-op dealers going on in Dundee and stuff like that.
Ethically
Totally.
minded.
Ethically minded. Yeah, they've got a code of conduct
I
and
like
everything
that.
like that. And, you know, so there's massive, and, you know, and you've got everything from your local, like people growing on their own to people growing in like small grows and supplying, you know, maybe 100 people or something like that, to then sort of gangs growing. So you've got all of this levels. You've got Police Scotland. So the policing of cannabis at the moment is that it's a low level priority. So possession it doesn't warrant a charge. You get what's called is a written police warning or a recorded police warning or an adult police warning, whatever they called it. But it's basically like a slip of paper that tells you that you've been warned. I can't even remember if there's a fine attached to it. And if you get caught again within 3 months, then it goes to the Procurator Fiscal. But they're not really interested in policing cannabis, or at least that's what the policy says. So that's the landscape in regards to the police, you know, in the sort of adult use market. In regards to the medicinal market, you have a lot of people now who are legally getting medicines from clinics. But once again, I mean, like just from anecdotal evidence, I mean, I know a lot of elderly people that are using cannabis because you're seeing it on the news and on Netflix and everything. But those that can afford to pay 500 quid a month can get a nice bit of bud, you know, and smoke a nice joint before they go to bed, or a tablet. Or, you can't get tablets yet, but drops or
You know, it's funny because I was thinking Scotland. I was actually thinking like Scottish tablet with cannabis. That's my mind went straight when you said tablet. I was like Scottish tablet.
Yeah,
Genius.
tablet. Totally.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, like people do make tablet,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
and brownies and all this
Yeah.
kind
I
of
thought
stuff.
that
Yeah,
was
no,
genius.
tablet is perfect. Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of there's quite a burgeoning market going on with people that wouldn't have traditionally used cannabis, but because of all the legalization that's going along around the world, a lot of people are using now that you know, for different ailments and stuff
Yeah.
like that, legally and illegally. So you've
Yeah.
got a mixed model market. In regards to the industry, it feels quite fractured. I know that there's quite a few farmers that have got hemp licenses to grow. We now have one farm down in the borders which has been given a research and development license and a wholesale and distribution license. So we now have a Scottish-based company that can distribute. But we also have several other Scottish-based companies I'm aware of that can import.
Yeah.
So in regards to starting up an industry, we're quite there. There's quite a lot of work going on in Dundee, but also in Roslin on the sort of it's called gene sequencing. I don't know if you've come across this
Yeah.
to
It's
do with
very small amount. Not enough to
yes,
talk about it anyway.
yeah. Well, I don't really understand it either, but it's to do with the fact that you can take you can take like an ailment, you know, medical condition, and you can genetically profile it, and then you can actually take the genetic profile of the plant, and through AI and all sorts of stuff, you can match up the right strain and volumes and measurements of all the different
I think that's where they're
stuff.
at in Canada. Canada's like right there with that form of medicine.
Yeah, so everyone's getting all excited about it. I mean, in the end of the day, I mean, you smoke you know, like it's the oldest known medicine. I mean, this is a thing that the biggest thing that I'm pushing whenever I talk to politicians or ministers or policy or medical or anyone is that it's the oldest known medicine to man.
Yeah.
And it was prescribed as a medicine for up to 100 different ailments up until 1971.
Yeah.
So we're not dealing with something that is unknown to us. It's just unknown to the way that we measure things in the last 30 to 40 years, you know? So anyway, so that's the landscape. And then there's a lot of people doing research, I mean, and trials. So it's all quite fractured. So for example, I found out the other day that there's a trial going on in Glasgow, in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, with adolescents with autism using cannabis for anxiety.
Right.
So anxiety induced by autism. And this is the same health board that are refusing to allow the prescribing of cannabis for people who are asking to be prescribed, particularly for treatment-resistant epilepsy. So there's a lot of differentiation. There's research, pockets of research around in Scotland, but there isn't just, we're a small enough country that we should be able to get a good chunk of everyone involved in cannabis, from the people who are currently growing and manufacturing illegally, right up to the people who are doing it legally, from the people who are using because they enjoy the feeling of getting high, right over to the spectrum of the people who are using because they're trying to cure their brain tumor.
Yeah.
You know, like we should all be able to get together and envisage what a fair trade, socially just cannabis law looks like in Scotland. It's not possible under the current laws, but there are things that are potentially flexible under the current laws.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of bugs me is the new medicinal growers, or it's like they've got an entire legacy market that's kept everybody propped up for years. You know, so they've got individuals who have an enormous amount of skill that's kind of that would be ordinarily disregarded as criminal. So there's individuals, and then you've got individuals who have qualifications or the specific career direction led them to then cultivating cannabis like legally. And just feels like that would be a great void to fill, kind of thing.
Well, I really want to do that. You know, this is called Conversations on Cannabis, and I was really trying to find a way, like, how do I get the voices of people who are currently growing and cultivating involved in a policy conversation that also involves the police and government and stuff, because that's really dangerous for them. You know, and this has always been the conversation around illegal drugs. I mean, me even doing this podcast, you know, like I have a job.
No anymore,
but I mean, I come from the term of lived and living experience, and I've been disclosing, you know, that's it. You know, it's not, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, and that's, you know, I've said it at conferences and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that when you're admitting to doing something that's still criminal, even if using cannabis is not technically a criminal offence in the first instance anymore, technically it's a civil offence. sort of.
Frustratingly though, that's what kind of bugs me slightly, because you'll have individuals. I mean, we talked about it earlier. There's a great quote that kind of amplifies. Obviously, medical cannabis smoked with tobacco is illegal, but if you smoked it with a vaporizer, it's completely legal. So it's like it's a really difficult position to even navigate. No wonder there's so many people. Like I think you mentioned earlier about when we were talking about the CAN card thing,
Yes.
and about how the fact that you've got individuals who are consuming medically legally because they've gathered their prescription in clinics in Scotland, and yet they can still be lifted and charged. It's like that's like what situation is that at the moment?
Well, where we're at the moment is that there was only really 2 instances where it was a bit ridiculous, like somebody had their cannabis taken off them when they clearly had evidence of a prescription, and so that came to the cross party, and we had conversations with the police, and now they've added basically added cannabis to the same policy that they have for things like Valium and benzodiazepines, or it's the same thing. But for pills, prescription pills, because obviously you can get them illegally as well. So you just have to show that you have a valid prescription. That's all you need: a valid prescription and proof of ID. And that valid prescription can be anything from a email from the clinic stating, or a letter that you've got saved on your phone, or even just the digital receipt. So there was a lot of confusion because some police were saying, "Oh, you need." They would prefer that the medication is in the container that it is supplied in.
Right.
But that's completely unfeasible for most people, because they get a month's worth of flour. They're not going to be carrying around a bloody, a couple of ounces of cannabis. So most people will put it into, and that's recognised. So I guess for anyone that's challenged now, is as long as they produce a valid legal prescription in some digital or paper form, then that's fine. The problem we have in Scotland that England don't have is that CAN card makes no difference up here. Because in England, the CAN card have been able to negotiate with the police that most police forces will see it as basically legitimate need. Because you can't get a CAN card unless your doctor says that they think that you would benefit from having cannabis.
Right. Okay.
But you don't need to have a legal prescription to get a CAN card. You just and so I think that is my understanding. And in England and Wales, my understanding is that the conversations that they've had with the police forces there, because the police forces are independent, they're run by they're independent in and of themselves. But not only that, but they've got victim and crime chief commissioners, and they're voted in, so they're able to make decisions that police force couldn't necessarily make, because they're saying, it's because I was voted in. So for example, in Durham, when they brought in a policy of not policing cannabis, that was brought in by the victim and crime chief commissioner, who was voted in, and he was allowed to do that. But in Police Scotland, we've got a hierarchical structure. It's just Police Scotland, and so they're scared to basically make any decisions or moves. So CAN card have entered into agreements with individual police forces that if somebody produces a CAN card, it's seen as legitimate need, and then that's 9 times out of 10 it's accepted. In Scotland, it doesn't matter if you produce a CAN card. You have the only thing that will be counted if you're caught with or found to be in possession of cannabis. The only thing that will stop the police from taking that cannabis off you and charging you with an adult police warning is a digital prescription, legal.
I mean, how would you go about essentially establishing a really effective drug policy behind that? I mean, I'm assuming there are numerous hurdles before you can even attempt to construct something like that. I mean, what's the main challenges that come to mind when you're attempting to realign how policies even orchestrated?
See, I am trying to do this, but I truly think that until or unless we get independence, we're constrained by Westminster. But there are things that we can do to mitigate that, and one of them is, and actually the only way that we can get a situation in Scotland where cannabis is not policed, and I think it's perfectly feasible for that, because it's an extremely strong public good argument for it, is if you've got a Lord Advocate's reference. So basically, the people that sort of like run policy in Scotland, or this kind of drugs policy, is the police, the government, or the Drugs Policy Division, the police, the Drugs Policy Division, and the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. And when the police, so for example, this adult police warning, that and the downgrading from all drugs, basically all possession of all drugs is now an adult police warning.
Right.
They won't tell you what the barriers are to when something's possession, when something's supply.
So sorry. So that means if somebody was to find with like heroin or cocaine or any of that kind of
Yes.
stuff, immediately it's regarded as like they wouldn't get.
Yes.
What's changed?
Not class A, so all class B and C.
Right.
Sorry,
Okay.
all class B and C.
Right.
Yeah, it's called a Lord Advocate's reference,
Right.
and they just in fact, I need to double check. I'm pretty certain it's all of them. I can't even believe that I can't remember that, but it's either B and C or all of them. But basically, last year, so initially she just did it for cannabis.
Right.
So 6 years ago, no, 8 years ago, then there was a recommendation that all drugs were basically dealt with this adult police or formal police warning,
Right.
rather than going to the procurator fiscal.
Mhm.
And it was actually just a fiscal thing. It was like the majority of drugs possession charges get dealt with either through a fine or they get dismissed. So just stopped all. It was actually an economic decision.
Yeah.
But they decided to keep it to cannabis because if it looks like cannabis and smells like cannabis, it is cannabis. And whereas there's an issue with white powders, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But then,
like washing the fucking dishes.
Yeah, exactly. But then, then you got the fucking what's it called? The bloody Psychoactive Substances Act, which has just thrown a whole whammy into that because it's actually legal to, possess these NPS powders, but it's just illegal to supply them. So anyway, but the point is, 2 years ago or either last year, they then broadened it up and they did actually do all the substances. So it's and then it was a de facto decriminalization.
It's mental about this. It reminds me, I interviewed James Mills, and he talked about the passing the buck when it came to
yes, he's exactly passing the buck. I even had a chapter in my thesis called "Passing the Buck." No, it's called "Tossing the Hot Potato."
Yeah, nice. That's exactly the same thing. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. But for them, it was the imagery was just too much for me because I fucking couldn't. There was a point in my PhD where I was like,
drawing potatoes in your fucking thesis.
Oh man, but it was just this kind of like, no, I don't want to deal with it. No, I don't want to deal with it. No, I don't want to deal with it. And it was just like constantly like the fucking, and I was like, the three of you just need to sit down in a room and just fucking talk.
Yeah.
So you basically need the police, you need the Crown Office, and you need the government to sit down and say, I've got your back.
Yeah.
I've got your back. I've got your back. We agree, all three of us, that policing cannabis is not in anyone's interests.
Yeah.
It's not in the public interest. It's not in any of this. So we're going to. So, for example, when I was doing with the MCRS, because I did a law degree. So, and I don't know if this would work, but I think it would work. I mean, law is just creative, it gets written and then you can work around it. So, for example, the Misuse of Drugs Act, for every single offence, there is an alternative of a fine, and even with the more serious ones, but it never gets applied, obviously, because of guidance. But, and I was going, but for example, with cannabis, cultivation of cannabis, there's something like 14 years in prison and or a £2,000 fine.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, for social clubs, you can just go, right, okay, well, we're just going to apply a fine every year. That's all you need to do. If you really wanted to create a situation in the country where, there'll be issues with Proceeds of Crime Act and all that, but there are flexible ways that you can do it. And if you wanted to do it, you could, but it does involve, the first step, and I'm trying to get this started, is, and I know that some of the parties involved are interested, is to get these guys sat down in a room and go, okay, the first thing we want to do is the Lord Advocate's reference to say that in Scotland, we will no longer police the consumption or cultivation of cannabis, of up to 6 cannabis plants, or they could easily do that, absolutely easily. There's so many other constitutional issues. I can't exactly see the bloody UK government trying to, they might try and fight that one, but they can go to the court with the other 25 to 30 law cases that are going on that they're fighting the Scottish government for, saying that it's unconstitutional. So
the thing with the 6 plants, that's perfect. They don't need any more than 6.
No, you don't. And then you get social clubs, and then you can just implement a little thing of like, we're going to give exemption for these people, to grow this. It's all perfectly doable. Where there's a will, there's a way, but there isn't a will.
That's interesting. That's what makes me think. Like the absence of will, sometimes I think is that the individuals that are in positions that could influence this would see it as like an embarrassment. Like I think that it was one of the Dutch MPs had said something like, we're seen as one of the Europe's. He'd used a derogatory term for a hippie, essentially, and that's what it's like. Sometimes people interpret that as like, if we were to change
Isn't
the law for
hippie a
cannabis.
derogatory term, isn't it?
Well,
Itself?
it's well for people that are that, not they're like
Yeah, I'm happy to.
exactly.
I want to be a hippie and I
Yeah.
want to smoke marijuana.
And that's the thing. That's one of the things that I always think is like that. It's because people think that they're going to be ridiculed. Oh, there's Scotland with their cannabis. They're like,
Yeah.
and I genuinely like the cannabis
No,
social
see, but
clubs
this
are
is
so
where we
important.
create the different narrative. So a thing that we're doing is we're doing with the Scottish Psychedelic Research Group, we're trying to bring back this concept of indigenous apothecary.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that, or the knowledge, the fact that cannabis was a plant that grew, well, you wouldn't say naturally, but it was certainly brought over here. I mean, several thousand years ago, and it was cultivated.
I was going to say like 1800s, but it was thousands of years ago.
No, yes. I mean, it was a plant that grew here, and it was cultivated. I mean, they've got evidence back in I mean, actually, Linda Hendry, who's
Yeah, Linda Fittland done
yes,
quality.
yes,
Right.
she's got a lot of knowledge around this. Actually, she sent me a document once that was just showing how place names, and it can go all the way back to the abbey, the islands on the Firth.
Right.
They were abbeys, and they used to grow cannabis as a plant of healing.
Right.
And Traprain Law, I mean, they found seeds there, dating back to maybe 500 AD,
You could
600
try and get
AD.
those varieties, get them out fucking side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's what they're kind of doing in Dundee and places like that, is trying to genetically sort of find the ones that work best for growing outdoors in Scotland and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of people that grow it. I mean, it was cultivated in Scotland as a plant for rope and clothing and also medicine for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we're trying to bring that narrative to the Scottish Parliament. So instead of trying to say, look out there, the world is changing, we're all legalizing cannabis, we should move with the times, it's more like, no, look here, look at this medicine that we have had and have been using up until 50 years ago, and then stopped using because of a war on drugs by some dudes in America. And look how many people are currently using it and currently benefiting from it. So it's called a celebration of Scotland's indigenous apothecary. There's the other one that we're linking in. I know this is about cannabis, but we're linking into psychedelics, particularly Liberty Cap and Amanita.
Right.
And sort of hoping to or beginning to have that conversation about how these herbs and these traditions were used by Scottish indigenous cultures up until they were effectively wiped out by Christianity, with the last kind of great hole or Christianity. I don't want to say Christianity. I want to say white male dominated Christianity. Nice. Okay,
I'm going to get kidnapped halfway through this fucking interview.
I'm sorry, I've said it a few times, haven't I? Said there's white male.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm terribly sorry.
It's like I'm sitting here very white.
I know. But what I'm thinking of, and I hope, because obviously it's no reflection, and I actually have to say it to my students in the class, because I go on a bit of a rant about it. And then I'm like, I'm so sorry, because there's white men are beautiful, obviously, but it's more of an energy. It's so it was that patriarchal domination sort of thing. So with the medicine in the sort of 13th, 14th, 15th century, where women were, and men, but mainly women, were kind of like herb and wise women and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you had the witch hunts. And, there's different narratives attached to that. But one of the narratives that we're uncovering and also wanting to highlight is that many of those women would have been using psychedelics. So, for example, the witch's ointment, which was an ointment that the witches put on their vagina or their eyes. Right. So they put them on their eyes when they were midwiferying, where apparently it was to do with, they said that it connected them with the spirit world. And they put it on their vagina when they were doing
a good Friday night.
Just for a good Friday night, exactly, and rub the, because and one of the things I really want to kind of counter, because there's a big movement about the witches sort of going, oh, they were just normal people that were practicing herbalism, so all these stories of them being out in the woods dancing naked around and having orgies is just moral panics. But then if you look at the indigenous practices of psychedelics around the ritualistic use of them, they often did involve, fires, nakedness, sex, because sex is one of those sacred union
Mhm.
sort of ways of achieving sort of altered states of
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah.
So I don't think they were moral panics at all. I just think they were the indigenous people practicing the ancient practices of the land.
Mhm.
So we're trying to bring that back because obviously there's been a resurgence in psychedelics and medicine and ceremony and ritual, and cannabis is part of that as well. Um, and sort of bring back the narrative to go, no, this is actually providing an essential function in society in creating these altered states of consciousness that make us understand that reality is more than just sticks
Yeah.
and bricks and mortar, and therefore there, as we're beginning to understand this mind body connection,
Mhm.
and when you have that viewpoint, health and well-being,
Yeah.
having, because so many people go around their lives searching for that, trying to fill that hole,
Mhm.
and that hole is kind of just it's there. Now we're going off into existential stuff,
No,
but
not really, to be honest, because the psilocybin in particular has been like, I could probably put up right now the amount of fucking pieces of research that would just flood the entire internet of people consuming psychedelics and essentially relieving decades-long trauma that they're not been getting rid of.
yes,
You know what I mean? And it's
yes,
just continuously been present
hmm,
their entire being. Their 50s,
yeah,
60s, whatever. And then they consume psychedelics on one sitting.
yeah,
And it's the same thing when people are consuming like tobacco. People could like try to stop smoking cigarettes or alcohol, and they can't do it. And then it's one dose. And most of the time it's a really high dose that encourages
yeah.
spiritual engagement in some sense.
But it's funny because I mean I've come up the psychedelics community from a different angle because I mean being Scottish, it was a yearly ritual
Yeah,
to
every
go into the
October.
fields
Yeah,
every October.
yeah,
The mist is just at a
yeah,
certain time. Have to eat a couple to kind of
yeah,
so they start showing themselves, and we used to do really large trips, without any other sort of drugs, and then during my sort of like 20s and 30s, it's like I use mushrooms more in a social way. So, it's like you're at a party and everyone takes like, I don't know, 10 mushrooms, and it just
yeah,
enhances
yeah.
the,
It's like
ma-
coffee or something
yeah, well, it
almost.
just makes everyone start
Yeah,
laughing
yeah.
and finding everything hilarious and all, so that's how I've used them. So even though I'm heavily embedded within the psychedelic community now, I've only come to psychedelics in the form of ceremony and ritual, which is where this true healing takes place. So, for
Mm,
example, because psychedelics can be quite damaging in some ways if you don't
yeah.
know what you're doing. But we used to take mushrooms, and we always used to just feel like we'd say, "Oh, I'm doing a trip. We need to do it at least once a year or twice a
Mm,
year," and it felt like it was basically like a soul
yeah,
cleanser.
yeah, yeah,
You feel just really fresh
yeah.
afterwards. And this was long before I knew any of the kind of, you're talking like 95,
Mm,
96, like up until whenever
yeah.
2002, 3.
It shows you all the neuroscience of what that refreshing feeling is,
Well,
essentially.
now we know, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And this whole kind of idea of psychedelic assisted therapy is amazing. But I came to that ceremony and ritual from a completely different angle. And
Yeah.
it's been fascinating to meet people within the healing community who've only ever used psychedelics for spiritual or mental well-being.
Yeah.
Um, and that's why I'm really passionate about this whole conversation, is that even with cannabis, like it's all very well to talk about medicinal cannabis, but where does the boundary
Mm,
lie?
mm,
Like I don't know where one where therapeutic where recreational comes into therapeutic, when
mm,
therapeutic becomes medicinal,
yeah.
like at what part does the boundary lie? And quite frankly, if you were just allowed to use it, then you can do away with the
Mm,
whole lot. And all this concerns about mental health. I mean, well, maybe we should start looking at capitalism first,
yeah.
and maybe look at the way that we treat other people first, rather
Mm.
than trying to blame a drug around all of that kind of stuff. So yeah.
No, it's a good point because very often there's the demographics which are analysed to have a disproportionate number of drug consumption tend to be the economically the lower end of the economic scale most of the time. There's like a fragmented area of society which are kind of looking for something to get away from the societal stress kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely, and particularly in Scotland, and it's it's a mixture of deprivation, and sort of intergenerational deprivation, but also I think the weather.
Mm.
I think the weather's got a
It's
lot to do
raining
with it.
outside here. Where's that bag of mushrooms, mate?
Yeah, exactly. Or where's that kind of joint, or
Yeah,
where's
yeah,
that bit of heroin,
yeah.
or let's all go out and sit in somebody's house and take shitloads of drugs and
Mm,
just forget about everything. But it's you know, it doesn't help that we've had a fucking Tory government for the past God knows how long, in the 80s and now. But I also think it's got to do with the fact that the Scottish psyche is is really quite deep. And many of us are yearning. There's that yearning for something, and we can never quite put our finger on it.
Yeah.
And I had that yearning for many, many years. And then I did one ceremonial DMT trip, and after integrating it, I'm still integrating the experience, but it took about 6 months to properly integrate and realize that I no longer have that yearning, because I was shown true meaning of the universe.
I mean, could you detail from the consumption, the setting and all that, and your DMT experience? Can you, like, what was that?
Well, this is the thing. So, I mean, I was 42 at the time, or 40, 41 or whatever. And it's, you know, I've spent the last 20 years doing, like, you know, this, what a lot of other people do, a bit of meditation, loads of reading, you know, like everything, getting really into Jung towards the end, but also a lot of, like, you know, a lot of practice. So I've done, like, you know, the 10-day silent Vipassana meditation retreat. I've done all sorts of stuff. So there's been a lot of stuff that led up to me then, and also being on the journey, searching, you know, going, I want to go to that place. And so that all led to me being in, you know, a sort of ceremony with a friend. And it was a very sacred space, and we set the setting, and I didn't even do that much, but it was, and it only lasted like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's
Did you
not.
manage to get 3 talks? Was it the 3?
No, it was just 2.
Right.
It was just 2, and I didn't even ever get to that point where I wasn't conscious of my body or anything
Right,
like that
right.
at all. But it was just this deep, deep, and I wouldn't even say deep, just this knowing, just this knowing that the meaning of life is there is no meaning, and that we create meaning, and it sounds all meaningless when I say it like that, you know. But what it did was it removed that yearning, that search for meaning, because I think so many of us are searching for, what does it mean? What does it all mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you know, we can still investigate all the different levels, but ultimately it means nothing, because it's and I don't even have the language to be able to explain it. And I think what's really helped me to integrate it is things like Fridtjof Capra, who is a physicist, but he links Zen Buddhism into physics. And just all of those linkings have enabled me to sort of go, okay, there is now beginning to be a scientific explanation for that experience of oneness. But it's not even a oneness, you know, because when you think of oneness, you think of, like I was coming up the road today, and I was having one of those moments, and, you know, like John Lennon, all you need is love. And I'm like, well, it's not even like, love is like the precursor kind of energy, I guess, to that, but it's still a binary energy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, it's still, you know, it's, yeah. Whereas the actual reality is there is nothing. It's nothing. So
yeah. Sorry, everybody.
Sorry.
It's funny that we just.
But it doesn't mean that things are meaningless.
Yeah.
It just means that the ultimate meaning is that there is no meaning. Because
sometimes I think to myself, I think constructing it that way, you know, meaning. What is the meaning? Like, I think that might be at fault. Because I do this all the time. Like, I'm always like, what is this? What does this mean? What does this mean? And I think inevitably there's an interpretation of life that is inevitably only going to be interpreted with meaning. That's just that's the basis of it. So I think inevitably, I think the closer you get to what the true essence of the absolute would be something that you couldn't articulate anyway.
Well, no, you can't.
Like, you physically couldn't. And I think you see it often with people that take DMT, and then they go, oh, our words don't fit over there. Our language doesn't work in that place. So, like, they have dialogue. Whatever, speaking about like machine elves, all these different things. They have dialogues of through sound, but it's not articulated word. It's more like the sound of an emotion. Like, and that's like, you can't.
But
really...
even that. So this is what I find fascinating. So even that still exists within this concept of something.
Yeah, it's because of the perceiver. It can never be separate from that, I think, because you've got the perceiver.
Yes.
So there's always a perceiver.
Yeah. Whereas the experience I had with the DMT was, it wasn't like I wasn't even out. It was just like, it's just all of this is taking place. It has no meaning, but it still, it still exists, and we create meaning within that. I mean, I'm fascinated about the machine. I mean, I don't know much about DMT at all,
Yeah.
so all I know is my own experience and then little bits and bobs that I've read about. But it's I mean, yeah, it's a slight veer off from cannabis.
No, it's still in the same realm of consciousness and that thought.
That's true. That's
Exactly
true.
that.
Although, have you? I mean, I was reading recently. It was Harry Shapiro's got a book out called Fierce Chemistry, I think it is.
Right.
And oh no, it wasn't him. It was The Long Trip. That's it, The Long Trip. And it's a good book. And anyway, it was talking about people who are hallucinating under hashish.
Right.
And I've never ever had like major hallucinations with cannabis.
Right.
Like, apparently, so it's interesting, and I wonder if our brains were just different 150 years ago. Because I mean, the descriptions of some of the trips are the same kind of things you'd maybe expect to see on LSD.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow,
That's actually, that's a good point when you say I wonder if our brains are different, because a lot of, on the surface, people are like, that's ridiculous, they're still human beings, but the reality is we're like that, an internal biological structure influenced externally, and it's like you've got the internet, you've got TV,
Yeah.
and more, like in the past 20 years, that would be a really good, if you were to have like a social experiment from the 80s and 90s of the mind, well, not even the mind, the neural capacity, and you fast forward to the 2020, and to see how much of like instant on demand like
Yep.
viewing and all these
Yeah,
different
yeah,
things
yeah,
that
and how it impacts. I mean, I
impact.
remember when I first ever had a Facebook update thought,
Yeah.
and I was walking along the cliffs, and it was beautiful, and I just thought of something, but I thought of it in the way that as if I was making a Facebook update, and I was like, "Holy fuck,
Internal
that's
notification.
it! Oh my god, that's it!" And well, Facebook is the panopticon. I mean, that's when I
Yeah.
realized. I mean, I don't know if you know much about Foucault and this
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
of it. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that Facebook is the ultimate panopticon. It's like that's when I realized I had internalized the panopticon of Facebook, because my internal dialogue was monitoring and editing my own speech in order to make it fit with an update or a social media. But and it would be fascinating to see how our brains have changed and the consciousness. Apparently, I've heard somewhere that brains are shrinking, so they're smaller than they were 1,000 years ago. Apparently, which is odd.
I wonder what that means.
I don't know, because they always say a bigger brain means.
Or if anything, it would maybe be that, like we were talking about alchemy earlier on, there might be that fine tuning of getting rid of what's necessary, or what's not needed,
Yes.
and only keeping what's necessary.
Yes, that's like Aldous Huxley's "the brain is a reductive valve"
Yeah.
concept. Yeah, yeah. In fact, that was so when, and I may be interpreting this research wrong, but I'm pretty certain I am. But I remember when David Nutt and Carhart Harris did their research in Imperial College on psychedelics, and they did an MRI scan of somebody on psychedelics, and they basically, what they showed was that there was reduced activity within, like, overall.
Right.
Whereas what they'd expected to see was an increase in activity, because obviously it's creating hallucinations and everything. And that is like this for me. When I read that, I was like, oh my God, because that basically was scientific proof of Aldous Huxley's concept, the brain is a reductive valve, i.e., that concept. Yeah.
I'm probably interpreting it wrong. I thought he's mentioned, like, what he meant by the brain's reductive valve is that you have an ongoing, ever-present stream of information in the world, and your brain filters it.
Yes, so that is it. That is it. Because so basically, but it filters it, so therefore it's working a lot. It's working to filter all the stuff that's going on. Whereas with psychedelics, it reduces that filtering.
Right.
So actually, so it stops. So you're actually seeing.
All right. I thought it was when you took psychedelics, because it reduced the default mode network. I thought that then made you more receptive to greater information.
It makes you more receptive, but it reduces the overall activity. So it creates novel pathways in the brain, and sort of bits of the brain. But if you there's an image that's quite I don't know where it is. Well, look up the research actually, because there's an image where they basically got a normal waking brain versus one under a psychedelic state, and there's actually less activity in the psychedelic state than there is in the normal waking brain. Yes. Because and then you're like, oh my God. So actually, and that's what they say in this scientific paper. I mean, we literally are expanded consciousness. So basically there's more information going into the brain, but it's the default mode network is not processing it and turning it into reality as such. And if you've got kids, I mean, I remember when I was watching the kids from the ages of maybe about, sort of 8 months or sort of 3 months to when they first can sort of properly kind of engage, you can just see that they're seeing stuff that you don't. And they're like, you're having to teach them, oh, look, this is something that you can't walk into because it's hard. And I remember when I first, my oldest one, and then the second one, when they first came across depth of field, like they were staring at a light shade and was looking at it, and then it's like like that, and then like going around, and I'm like, my God, that happened because some neural pathway in his brain just got connected, and it went, right, this is what I need in order to navigate this reality. And that's what it is. It's like this constant
that's awesome to see that in real time happening. You're like, that's what's just, I love that.
I was just like, holy fuck, I was probably quite stoned. I mean, oh my God.
But yeah, I mean, before I touch back on cannabis, like, what do you see the next year happening? I mean, was it the 21st of February you've got?
So yes, so the next year is going to be quite exciting. So we've got a series of events, and I've also got to work. The goal that I said to Lisa that I want to have for cannabis, for medicinal cannabis, is to have the Scottish Intercollegiate Network Guidance, which is called SIGN, which are the equivalent of NICE, who are the National Institute for Research or Centre for Excellence, or whatever.
Ironically named.
Yeah, well, they're the ones that basically restricted the.
That's what I mean, like Centre of Excellence. And all these kids that need medicine.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And they don't even apply in Scotland. This is the issue. So they don't apply in Scotland, but our consultants are going by their guidance because in the absence of any other guidance. So our goal is is quite strategic, and we really want to do it, is to get a team together in order to approach SIGN and Health Improvement Scotland to basically start the process to actually doing a proper review. And in that, we want them to take in more evidence. So for the NICE guidelines, they just only took RCTs, randomized controlled trials, which is fine, but it's also completely naive and ridiculous because no piece of medicine only ever has RCTs as its piece of research. Everything starts off with observational trials and in lab trials and stuff like that, and then RCT if they can get to it. So we want to really convince the Scottish guidance community that in order, that they need to take in a range of different medical experts and expertise, and also a range of different evidence. So that we want that specifically for Bedrow-like cannabis, which is for treatment-resistant epilepsy. And I think that's the way to go, really, is the drip, drip, drip. So if we get that for one medicine, then we can then start looking at other medicines. So for example, chronic pain, I mean, now that we've got a farm that it can actually distribute wholesale, I think one of the fears that a lot of clinicians have is because actually chronic pain is the most widely evidenced one. But I think everyone's scared because if we allow that to get prescribed, like heroin, basically morphine and cocodamol and all these kind of things cost nothing, absolutely nothing. Whereas cannabis, in relative terms, costs a lot more. But that's only because we're having to import it. So that's another aim, is to try and get cannabis on the consultants register for pain. So that's one area.
Side point, I think if people were allowed to grow at home, that wouldn't be an issue.
Well, exactly, yeah. And so that's the other one, is working with the police to do that. So that's the kind of cannabis aims. And then the more wider one is we're having a series of events around just plant medicine more widely, because I think when you start focusing on the individual ones, you're kind of going, oh, well, that's safe, that's not safe. Da, da, da. But when you actually start to have a conversation about agency and autonomy of individuals to choose the medicine that they want in order to make their own healing, and to choose medicine that grows indigenously and is part of our own land, then you've got a much stronger argument, because you're actually going, well, this is a human right, this is our, and people might be like upset about using the term indigenous, but like, what makes somebody indigenous or not? Like the people of the land. I'm Scottish. I've got, if you want to fucking argue about it, I've got a family history back to the 13th century here. So, but I don't believe in that kind of, I think if you're born in a land, then you are part of that land. So, and if you come to a land and you make that land that land yours, then you are part of that land. So that's what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to reclaim the concept of indigenous medicine for Scotland, and basically say that we use this and we want to be allowed to use it.
That sounds excellent. Well, I'm really looking forward to being part of as much of that as possible.
Yay!
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it too.
Well, thanks for joining me, man. That's been quality.
Yay! Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Ross for giving me your time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.